November 25th, 2015. The night before Thanksgiving. In a few hundred supermarkets scattered across the northeastern United States, the registers are counted out for the last time, and the doors are locked. The timing was not chosen for poetry, but poetry is what it made. On the busiest grocery week of the American year, the week when every store in the country is a crush of turkeys and cranberries and flour, the company that had provisioned American Thanksgiving for a century and a half went dark on the eve of the feast. The last carts were gathered in, the lights went off over the checkouts, and a company 156 years old, older than the light bulb, older than the telephone, older than 30 of the 50 states' current borders, stopped existing. Here is the strange part. You may not have noticed. If you are under 50, there is a fair chance you have never heard the name at all, and an excellent chance you have no idea what it used to be. So let us say what it used to be, plainly, because no one alive quite believes it. This company was the largest retailer on the face of the earth. Not briefly, and not on a technicality. For roughly 4 decades, before Walmart existed, before Sears sold anything in a building, it was the biggest seller of goods in the world. At its peak, around 1930, it operated close to 16,000 stores. 1 out of every $10 Americans spent on groceries, in the whole country, passed through its registers. In the towns where it operated, it was $1.04. It was the first retailer in history to sell $1 billion of goods in a year. Its own coffee brand was, by some accounts, the best-selling coffee on the planet. And the United States government took it to court, criminally, and won. Not for cheating anyone, not for poisoning anything. The charge, when you strip away the legal language, was that this company had used its size and skill to make food too cheap. Ask the internet what it remembers about this company, and the answer is not the empire, and not the trial. 200 people will give you the same answer, and it is a smell. Fresh ground coffee, because at the end of every checkout line stood a red grinder, and customers ground their beans while the groceries were bagged, and the smell filled every store, every day, for 50 years. People who hated coffee remember standing in that cloud on a mother's hip. Grandmothers who have been dead 30 years are remembered by it. The company was the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. America called it the A&P. This is the story of the first great chain, the Walmart before Walmart, the machine that taught the world to sell food cheaply, and of how it was attacked for a generation for being too good at it, then spent 60 years dying of the strangest disease in this entire series. It was not killed by a raider. It was killed by its own will. The Tea Store. Lower Manhattan, 1859. On Gold Street near the docks, a hide and leather merchant's son opens a shop selling the single most marked-up product in the American pantry. Tea, in 1859, reached an American kitchen through a chain of hands. Importer, broker, jobber, wholesaler, grocer. And every hand took its cut, so that by the time the leaves were in the pot, they had multiplied in price many times over. George Gilman's idea was the oldest good idea in commerce, applied where nobody had dared. Buy it at the ship, sell it over your own counter, skip everyone in between, and split the difference with the customer. It worked immediately, and the reason it worked is the reason this video exists. Tea was the luxury of the poor, the one small ceremony a laborer's household kept. And cutting its price by half was not a commercial event in those households. It was a raise. The store's genius, from the first week, was to aim its efficiency not at the carriage trade, but at the kitchen table. And that aim never wavered for a century. Every innovation this company ever made, and it made most of the innovations there were, was in service of one customer, the woman counting coins at the counter. The shop became the Great American Tea Company, and the theater of it was pure 19th century. Red and gold storefronts, a cashier's cage shaped like a Chinese pagoda, premiums given away with the pound, lithographs, china, glassware. Housewives collected the dishes the way their great-granddaughters would collect stamps. And in 1869, with the Transcontinental Railroad joining the oceans and the whole country suddenly feeling like one market, Gilman renamed the enterprise with the swagger of the age, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, a name that claimed a continent while the company was still, in truth, a string of tea shops along the eastern seaboard. The man who made the name true was not Gilman. It was his clerk. George Huntington Hartford had joined the firm young, and when Gilman drifted off to live on his fortune in the 1870s, Hartford was left effectively running it, 70 stores, $1 million a year. He ran it for the rest of his life, and then his sons ran it for the rest of theirs, And that is the first thing to understand about this company. For very nearly a century, through its entire rise and its entire reign, the A&P was run by exactly three men, a father and his two sons, with a continuity of purpose that no public company in this series ever had, or could have. The sons were called Mr. George and Mr. John, by everyone, always. George, the elder son, was the inside man, cautious, financial, a man who checked the pennies. John was the merchant, tall, theatrical, the one with the feel for the customer. They shared adjoining offices and a single conviction, learned at their father's counter, that would build the biggest store on earth and then, decades after their deaths, quietly destroy it. Sell cheap. Whatever else happens, sell cheap. The Economy Store, Jersey City, 1912. In a rented room, with $3,000 of fixtures and stock, the Hartford brothers open a grocery store designed like a stripped rifle. By 1912, the A&P had 400 stores, and they were fat. Credit accounts, delivery wagons, premiums, clerks who courted the customer. John Hartford's proposal, which the family debated like a heresy, was to throw every one of those comforts overboard. The new format had no credit, no delivery, no telephone orders, no premiums, no frills of any kind. One man ran it. Cash on the counter, carry it home yourself. Everything the customer did not strictly need was stripped out, and every dollar saved went into the price on the shelf. They called it the Economy Store, and it cost so little to open, $3,000, a fifth the weight of a conventional store, that the A&P could open one anywhere there were a few hundred families, and close it again without pain if it failed. It almost never failed. The format returned its capital within months, and the brothers, understanding exactly what they had, did the thing this series has seen only the greatest ones do. They bet everything, and they moved at a speed that has never really been equaled since. The genius of the format was who ran it. One man. The Economy Store had exactly one employee, its manager, perhaps with a boy to help on Saturdays. The company gave him a standardized room, a standardized stock list, a manual that specified everything down to where the tea stood, and a share of the take above target. He was a shopkeeper with none of a shopkeeper's risks, and a company man with a shopkeeper's hunger, and there were soon thousands of him, in identical rooms, from coast to coast. It was the McDonald's insight, 3 decades before McDonald's. Perfect standardization, locally motivated, applied to the most ordinary purchase in human life. 400 stores in 1912. 1,600 by 1915. By 1925, 13,961. Read that middle passage again, because the arithmetic deserves it. Across the 1910s and early 1920s, the A&P opened, on average, several new stores every working day, for years on end, not by franchising, not by acquisition, but one rented storefront at a time, from Maine to the Mississippi. A new A&P opened somewhere in America roughly every few hours. No retailer had ever grown like it. Arguably, adjusting for the size of the country, none ever has again. By 1930 there were on the order of 16,000 of them, and the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company was, by sales, the largest retailer that had ever existed. Nearly $3 billion a year through the checkouts, in Depression dollars, at a time when $1 billion was still a number used mainly by governments, and the two men at the top of it lived like the sons of a bookkeeper, which is what they were. No yachts to speak of, no scandals, no debt. The company financed its entire continental expansion out of its own earnings, borrowed from no one, and put its profits back into lower prices. John Hartford had a saying that served as the company's whole philosophy, and it is worth carving somewhere, given everything this series has watched. You can't earn a profit on a customer you don't have. A smell. Any small town in America. A Saturday morning in 1938. The screen door of the A&P swings, and half the people reading this, or their mothers, or their mothers' mothers, are standing inside it. The store is not large. Wooden floors, in the older ones, that creak in remembered ways. Sawdust scattered by the meat counter, where a bell sits on the case. Ring it, and the butcher appears at the window in his apron. The shelves carry the company's own names, and those names are a roll call that can still start arguments in a comment section. Ann Page, on the peanut butter and the ketchup and the school lunch liverwurst in its tube. Jane Parker on the bread, a quarter a loaf, and on the Spanish bar cake, a spiced raisin loaf under white frosting that grown men in their 80s still describe, unprompted, with their eyes half closed. Sultana. Yukon Club sodas, 3 cans for a quarter. Super, right on the meat. And at the front, beside every register, the machine that owns this company's afterlife, the coffee grinder. The A&P sold its coffee as whole beans. 8 o'clock in the red bag for every day, red circle a step up, Bokar in the black bag for the serious, and you ground it yourself, in the store, at the checkout, while your groceries were bagged, which meant that every A&P in America, every hour of every day, smelled of fresh ground coffee. Not faintly, overwhelmingly. It is, by an enormous margin, the most repeated memory attached to this company, ahead of any product, any price, any person. Children who loathed coffee stood by the grinders to breathe. Customers walked through the door and inhaled before they shopped. An entire generation's memory of buying food is, at bottom, one smell. And when those people write about their dead mothers, as they constantly do under any film about this company, the mother and the coffee arrive in the same sentence. The boy at the register bagged your groceries. He wheeled them out. He loaded your car. He was not permitted to accept a tip. And the store was cheap. Reliably, boringly, mercifully cheap, through the Depression and the war and the squeezed years after, in a way that working families built their arithmetic on. Listen to the people who lived it, because their testimony has a common shape, and the shape is the point. A man keeps his father's gold watch. It is engraved, 40 years, produce manager, the Bronx. Another paid his way through college at the registers. Another met his wife there, 40 years married now, and counting. A woman worked the checkout in a small Indiana town. Her son still cannot speak of the store without speaking of her funeral. A delivery boy in 1962 rode the bicycle with the big wire basket. 25 cents an hour. He remembers the manager's name. They all remembers a manager's name. They all remembers the manager's name. No one remembers a corporation. They remember a room, a wage, a smell, and a person. That is what 16,000 small rooms actually were, and why the accounting that follows in this story never once measured what it was destroying. The stamps came later, and deserve their sentence, because half the people who remember them wrong. The A&P's stamps were plaid stamps, not the green ones. Those belonged to the competition, pasted into books on kitchen tables and redeemed for lamps and toasters and birthday presents in lean houses. Wednesdays were double stamp days, and mothers planned the week around them. At the end of every fourth aisle, in the manner of the age, stood a floor ashtray, for the customers who shopped smoking. That was the A&P at noon, the biggest store on earth, and the humblest, a giant made entirely of small rooms that smelled of coffee. The ship turns. Elizabeth, New Jersey, 1936. In a converted garage, a competitor is doing to the A&P what the A&P did to everyone else, and the brothers are watching. The supermarket was not the A&P's idea, and the fact needs stating plainly, because it is the moment the company met its own method coming the other way. In the early 1930s, showmen with names like King Cullen and Big Bear opened stores of a kind nobody had seen. Vast, ugly, cheap barns on the edges of towns, with parking lots, self-service aisles, and prices below anything the chains could touch. The trade press laughed at them. The customers, in the depth of the Depression, drove past a dozen little A&Ps to reach them. In 1933, for the first time in the Hartford's lives, the great machine's sales fell. Hard. What happened next is the passage that separates the A&P of the founders from every dying giant in this series, and it deserves to be famous. John Hartford looked at the barbarians, concluded they were right, and turned the ship. The company that had 16,000 small stores began, deliberately, to destroy them, closing its own locations by the thousand, and replacing them with supermarkets of its own. 100 at first, then relentlessly. By 1938 it ran 1,100 supermarkets. By 1950, the conversion was complete. Around 4,000 big stores stood where 16,000 small ones had been, and the A&P was still, comfortably, the largest food retailer in the world, having cannibalized, with its founder's own hands, nearly its entire estate. Hold that against everything you have watched in this series. Blockbuster could not bring itself to gut its stores for streaming. Sears could not kill its catalog until the killing was meaningless. The A&P, faced with the same test, executed the self-slaughter in 15 years and came out the other side still wearing the crown. It remains one of the greatest acts of self-disruption in business history, and it bought the company exactly one more generation, because the men who ordered it were mortal, and the structure that followed them could never have done it, as we are about to see. And it was at exactly this moment, with the machine at its second peak, that its own country turned on it. Public Enemy and 1,000 Small Towns, the 1930s. The most hated corporation in America is the one selling the cheapest bread. It is almost impossible from this distance to convey how much political fury the chain stores generated, and the A&P, being the biggest by far, stood for all of them. The grievance was real, and it has a familiar shape. Every A&P that opened took its trade from somebody, from the independent corner grocer, the wholesaler who supplied him, the jobber, the broker, the whole ecosystem of middlemen that the Hartford's machine had been explicitly designed to bypass. Main Street was dying, said the movement, and the chains were killing it. If that sentence sounds familiar, it should. It is the Walmart argument, and later the Amazon argument, delivered 50 years early with better organization. Radio preachers thundered against the chains to audiences of millions. Pamphlets called the company un-American. Merchants' associations organized boycotts. States passed special chain store taxes, levies that scaled with the number of stores you operated, designed nakedly to punish size, and by the late 1930s more than half the states had some version. Then Congress reached for the axe. A Texas populist named Wright Patman proposed a federal tax on chains so constructed that, applied to a company with 16,000 stores, it would have exceeded the A&P's entire profit. Read that twice. Not regulation. Abolition, by arithmetic. The bill had a nickname in the trade press, and the nickname was honest. The death sentence. The A&P fought back with something close to the first modern corporate public relations campaign, and with a quieter argument, which had the disadvantage of being true. Its prices were roughly 10% below the independents. For a working family spending a third of its income on food, the chain store was worth more than a pay rise. The housewives of America, who had no lobby, voted with their baskets, and Patman's death tax failed. But Congress did pass something in 1936, the Robinson-Patman Act, a law against discriminatory pricing whose practical effect was to make it legally dangerous for a big buyer to buy too well. And in the 1940s, the Department of Justice picked up the logic and carried it to its conclusion. The trial. Danville, Illinois, 1946. In a federal courtroom, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, and the Hartford brothers personally, are convicted of a crime. The government's case, brought under the antitrust laws, was years in the making and dense as a phone book. But its heart can be stated in one uncomfortable sentence. The A&P bought its goods directly, manufactured much of what it sold, ran its own warehouses and bakeries and canneries and coffee roasters, and used the savings from all of that vertical integration to charge customers less than competitors who could not match it. Prosecutors called it restraint of trade, a giant using low margins as a weapon, squeezing suppliers, underselling rivals, bending an industry around its own efficiency. Strip the Latin off, and the A&P was convicted of being too good at making food cheap. The proceedings had a texture that reads, now, like satire. Prosecutors produced internal memoranda in which executives urged lower prices and higher volume, and read them to the court as evidence of predatory intent. The company's crime, witness by witness, assembled itself into a portrait of a firm that bought shrewdly, ran its own plants, watched its costs like a hawk, and passed the difference to the public, which was all true, and had been the whole idea since Gold Street. The brothers, by then in their 70s, sat through it. Mr. John, asked once what the company's strategy was, had given the answer that a later age would put on business school walls. We would rather sell 200 pounds of butter at 1 cent profit than 100 pounds at 2 cents. That was the crime. The court agreed that it was one. The court fined the company, and fined the brothers personally, $10,000 each. Sit with that number for a moment. The largest retail enterprise in human history, at the end of a decade-long federal crusade, fined the price of a large house. The absurdity of the penalty gives the game away. This was never really about damages. It was about establishing that the thing itself, the low-cost, integrated, everything-under-one-roof machine, was on the wrong side of the law. The conviction was upheld on appeal in 1949, and the government pressed on toward its real goal, which it said out loud, breaking the A&P into pieces. Only in 1953, with a new administration, was the breakup finally dropped. John Hartford did not live to see the reprieve. He died in 1951, in the lift of the Chrysler Building, on his way out of a board meeting. And here is the historical joke, so dark it barely needs telling. Within a single generation, the format the government had tried to outlaw as unfairly cheap would be standard practice for every supermarket in the world. The arguments the prosecutors made against the A&P would be recycled, almost word for word, against Walmart. And the A&P itself would be dying, not because it was too efficient, but because it had stopped being efficient at all. Because the real damage of those 20 years was never the fine. It was what the siege did to the company's nerve. A generation of A&P executives learned, in their bones, that growing, building, integrating, and cutting prices brought subpoenas. The company that had opened a store every few hours stopped reaching. And when the great post-war transformation of American food retail arrived, the boldest company of the century met it in a defensive crouch. Dividend machine. Montvale, New Jersey, and Wall Street, 1957. The last Hartford dies, and the strangest killer in this series walks into the story wearing the face of a charity. Understand first what the A&P had already half missed. The supermarket, the vast self-service store with parking, invented in the 1930s by upstarts with names like King Cullen and Big Bear, was everything the economy store was not. Big, bright, suburban, built for the car. The A&P had followed, eventually and competently, converting thousands of little stores into supermarkets through the 40s. But it followed as a conservator, not a founder. Its supermarkets ran smaller, older, dimmer than the competition's, and the gap never closed. As late as 1971, half the chain's stores were under 8,000 square feet, in an industry building at 30,000. Why? Why did the richest grocer on earth build small and slow? The answer is the will. George and John Hartford had no heirs who wanted the business. Their shares, control of the company, passed into the John A. Hartford Foundation, a medical philanthropy, and the foundation had exactly one financial need: income. A charity does not want its endowment reinvested in distribution centers. It wants dividends every quarter to fund its grants. And so, from the 1950s onward, the A&P was run, under Ralph Berger, the loyal former secretary who now ran both the company and the foundation, as a machine for producing dividends. Year after year, the great retailer paid out nearly everything it earned to its charitable owner, and starved itself. The numbers of the starvation are simple. Through the 50s and 60s, the A&P paid out the overwhelming bulk of its earnings as dividends, year upon year, while its competitors paid out a third and built with the rest. Every new Kroger was financed by a dividend Kroger did not pay. Every unrenovated A&P was a grant check somewhere doing good. The company's capital budget was set, in effect, by a charity's spending plan, and a charity's spending plan has no line for the year 1985. Stop and look at the shape of that, because it is the shape of this whole series, wearing its most innocent costume. Toys R Us was drained by private equity firms, Blockbuster by a departing parent, Kmart and Sears by a hedge fund. The A&P, first and slowest, and most completely, was drained by a medical charity, doing good works, funded by a corpse that took 60 years to fall over. No villain, no greed even, just an owner whose need for cash outranked the company's need for a future, which is the one disease in this series that no amount of virtue cures. Ralph Berger deserves his portrait, because his kind recurs in this series and is never recognized in time. He was not a fool and not a thief. He had joined the company as a clerk in 1911, the year before the economy store. He had served the brothers his whole life, latterly as the keeper of their calendars and their intentions, and when they were gone, he ran their company the way a devoted butler keeps a dead master's house. Everything preserved, everything polished, nothing changed, nothing risked. Asked for direction, he was said to reach for what Mr. John would have done. But Mr. John's method had never been preservation. It had been demolition on schedule. The butler kept the house exactly as it was, and the house, unrenovated, began its long slide toward condemnation. His one bold stroke, in 1961, was to spend a fortune acquiring the company that made trading stamps, plaid stamps, and push them into every store, a promotional answer to a structural problem. It flopped. The board, stacked with foundation men, finally eased him out in 1963, a decade too late. The pattern held to the end of the century. The A&P changed chief executives, the way a sick man changes doctors, and kept the disease, because the disease was the ownership. The stores aged. The prices, once the whole point, drifted upward past the competition. The company clung to its own brands, Ann Page, Jane Parker, while television taught America to want national ones. Talented managers left for chains that were building. By the 1960s, the A&P was still the biggest grocer in the country, and everyone in the industry knew it was hollow. A name, a habit, and a smell, coasting on the affection of customers who were themselves growing old. And when it finally tried to fight, it fought like an old man remembering a war. A long fall. Across America, 1972. The A&P declares a price war, the weapon of its youth, and nearly bleeds to death on it. Picture the fleet it went to war with. Stores from the 40s, half of them under 8,000 square feet, the size of a modern pharmacy, while the competition built at 30,000. Narrow aisles, old coolers, high labor costs from decades of seniority, low volume from decades of drift. This was the army. The generals ordered it to charge. The campaign was called WEO, Warehouse Economy Outlet, and it was John Hartford's 1912 playbook run at 1972 scale. Slash prices across the board, accept losses, win back the customer. But 1912 had worked because the stores were cheap to run. In 1972, the A&P's stores were small, old, overstaffed and under-trafficked, the highest-cost fleet in the industry, now selling at the lowest prices. The result was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was a massacre. The company that had never borrowed lost more money in 2 years than in its entire prior history, wounded its competitors' profits, and won back nothing that stayed. After that, it is a long dusk, and this series has taught you every beat of it. The consultants arrive. A third of the stores close in one plan. A chief executive is imported from a healthier chain and closes 1,500 more. And for a moment in the mid-70s, the smaller, newer fleet actually works. Sales per store nearly double. Then inflation eats the margin, and in 1979, the unthinkable, stated in one sentence. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the largest retailer in the history of the world within living memory, was sold to a German grocery family, the Haubs of the Tengelmann Group, for about $7 a share. The foundation, needing income to the end, took the money. Take in the full weight of the 1979 sale before moving past it. Within the lifetime of its older customers, this company had been the largest commercial enterprise of its kind on Earth. So large that the Congress of the United States designed taxes specifically to kill it. It sold for about $7 a share to a family grocer from Mulheim, because no American buyer wanted it. The empire that survived Wright-Patman, the Justice Department, 2 world wars and the Depression was carried out of the national story, not by an enemy, but by an estate agent. What followed was 35 years of afterlife, and it can be told with mercy, in a paragraph. The German owners were patient and serious, shrank the company to a regional grocer, bought local chains, Waldbaum's, the Food Emporium, Farmer Jack, and ran the northeastern remnant respectably for a generation, mostly under the old red oval. The end came the way these ends now come, a debt-heavy merger with the Pathmark chain in 2007, on the eve of a recession, with a private equity fund on the other side of the table. Chapter 11, in 2010, a brief private equity afterlife, and a final Chapter 11 in July 2015, in which the last 296 stores were auctioned to rivals or closed. The remaining doors were locked, as we began, on the night before Thanksgiving 2015. The final years supplied the series' familiar images, for the few who were watching. The 2007 Pathmark merger, done with borrowed money on the eve of a recession, with a private equity fund across the table. The one conventionally modern wound in this very old story, and the one the internet's amateur historians reach for, because it is the part that looks like all the others. The 2010 bankruptcy. The brief, hopeful, private equity-financed afterlife. The second filing in July 2015, and the auction of the remnants. A store to this rival. A dozen to that one. The names Waldbaum's and Pathmark and Food Emporium going down with the flagship. Employees with 30 years' service learned the end from the news. It was, by then, a regional story. The New York papers covered it the way they cover the closing of a beloved diner. 156 years. And what happened next is, in its way, the most remarkable chapter of all. Nothing happened. The forgetting. The internet today. Search the name, and see what the world's memory returns. Every company in this series left a wound. Toys R Us trended for weeks. Grown men photographed the dead giraffe. Blockbuster is a punchline so alive, there is a tourist store in Oregon. Sears' abandoned headquarters draws millions of views. And the A&P left almost nothing. Bigger in its day than any of them. Bigger, against its own era, than Walmart is against ours. Nothing. There are perhaps a half-dozen substantial videos about it on all of YouTube. Search its initials and the algorithm serves up anatomy courses and aircraft mechanic exams. The largest retailer in the history of the world has lost custody of its own name to an abbreviation for a nursing prerequisite. Under the few films that do exist, the comment sections are unlike any others in this genre. No jokes, no memes, No teenagers discovering ruins, just elderly people, quietly, telling each other about their mothers. The only people at the funeral are the family. There is even a literary monument, and its fate completes the picture. In 1961, John Updike published a short story called A&P, a teenage checkout clerk, 3 girls in bathing suits, a small doomed act of gallantry by the Register. It became one of the most anthologized American short stories of the century. Millions of students have been assigned it. Ask them today what the title means, and they will tell you it is just the name of the store in the story. The story outlived the referent. The monument stands. The thing it commemorated has evaporated from under it. Why? Why does the first and greatest of them all get no ghost stories, no ruin tourism, no ironic t-shirts? Partly because it died too slowly. There was no shock, no single terrible year, no giraffe with a suitcase, just 60 years of shrinking, so gradual that each town's loss felt local, and the national death, when it finally came, was the death of something already forgotten. And partly because its glory days sat too early. The empire peaked in 1930. The people who saw 16,000 stores are gone. The people in the comment sections knew only the long dusk, and loved it anyway, for the coffee and the cake in their mother's hands, which leaves the smell as the entire estate. 8 o'clock coffee, the red bag, was sold off in 2003 and survives. Owned today by an Indian conglomerate, still on American shelves. The one organ of the empire still functioning. People in their 70s report buying it still, not because it is the best anymore, but because opening the bag is the only door left into the store. One woman wrote that her grandmother, in Los Angeles, called every supermarket she ever entered the A&P, until the day she died. The brand so vast in her youth that it had become her word for the whole idea of a grocery store. The name that became the word for the thing, and then vanished, while the word Walmart moved into the space it left. What the trial was about. Gold Street to Montvale, 1859 to 2015. The verdict on this one reaches further back, and further forward, than any other in the series. The A&P was not killed by Walmart, which merely finished, in the 1990s, a decline then already 40 years old. It was not killed by the government, though the government tried harder to kill it than it has ever tried with any retailer since, and left scars on the company's nerve that never healed. It was killed by its own inheritance, by a will that handed the greatest retail machine on earth to an owner that needed income instead of a future, and by the 60 years of underinvestment that followed, as surely as if a hedge fund had done it, with none of the malice and all of the effect. Starvation does not care whether the hand withholding the food belongs to a raider or a foundation. That is, at bottom, the finding of this entire series, proven here in its purest form. It is never the competitor, it is always the owner. And yet even that is not quite the whole finding, because this company, alone in the series, was also once the counterproof. In the 1930s, with its founders alive, the A&P met an existential disruption and did the impossible thing. It tore itself down and rebuilt in the new shape, at full speed, by choice. The capacity existed. It was not a law of nature that these giants must freeze. It was a matter of who owned them and what the owner wanted. The A&P under merchants disrupted itself. The A&P under a foundation could not repaint a store. Same name, same aisles, same coffee. Different owner. Different fate, but this story carries a second verdict, and it belongs not to the company but to the country. In 1946, the United States convicted its largest grocer of crimes whose practical substance was selling food too cheaply, and spent a decade trying to dismantle it, at the demand of merchants it undersold. In the name of a main street its customers were abandoning voluntarily, basket by basket, dime by dime. 70 years later, the same country holds the same argument about other giants, with the same words, and does not remember holding it before. The A&P case is the missing memory of the American argument about bigness, the proof that the fight is a cycle, that the giant of every era looks eternal and is not, and that the thing which actually ends the giant is never the law and never the protest. It is the slow shift of the customer, and the slower failure of the owner. 16,000 stores. The first billion-dollar year in the history of selling things. A father and 2 sons who built it across 90 years, borrowed nothing, and were prosecuted for their prices. A charity that loved its income to death. A quiet lock turning on the night before Thanksgiving. 9 stories now, and the ledger of this channel is easy to read. The companies die. The things survive, when they were real. The parts survive Radio Shack. The houses survive Sears. CarMax survives Circuit City. Foot Locker survives Woolworth. Allstate and Discover survive the empire that dreamed them up. What survives the A&P is smaller than any of those, and it may outlast all of them, because it is not a company at all. It is carried in the nervous systems of a few million elderly Americans, and it fires, without permission, every time a bag of coffee is opened anywhere near them. And in a few 100,000 kitchens, this morning, a red bag of coffee, opened by someone in their 70s, for a reason they would struggle to explain to their grandchildren. It was never the stores. The stores were only ever rooms. The smell. Next time, the chain that put a book superstore in every American suburb, taught the country to drink coffee in an armchair among 100,000 titles, and then handed its entire future, its website, its customers and its fate, to a small online company in Seattle, and shook hands on it. That story is next.